The floor was cold. Tomiko could feel it through her thin cotton dress as she lay there, her body shaking with fever. The medical ward at Fort McClellan smelled like disinfectant and something else she couldn't name. Clean. Everything in America smelled clean. Her vision blurred as footsteps approached, heavy boots on tile. This was it. This was where the cruelty would finally begin. But the American doctor didn't spit on her. He didn't laugh. He knelt beside her on that dirty floor and slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. His touch was gentle, careful, as though she were made of glass. He lifted her onto the examination table with his own hands, as though she mattered, as though her life had value. 47 Japanese women stood frozen in the doorway, watching. They had been told Americans would rape them, torture them, parade them through the streets as trophies of war. Instead, this gray-haired man was checking her pulse, his face creased with concern, speaking soft words in broken Japanese. "You're safe. I help." They expected cruelty. They received care. And in that moment, everything they had been taught began to crumble. If this story moves you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true accounts from World War II. These histories deserve to be remembered. 3 months earlier, Michiko had been standing in the ruins of a field hospital outside Manila, watching American bombers turn the sky white with tracer fire. She was 28 years old, a trained nurse, and she was watching her world end. The other nurses had already fled. The wounded soldiers lay in rows on stained mattresses, crying for water, for their mothers, for death. Some had been there for days without medication, without food. The morphine had run out weeks ago. The bandages were made from torn sheets, already reused so many times they fell apart when you touched them. August 15th, 1945. The radio announcement came through crackling static. The Emperor's voice, thin and reedy, speaking words that didn't make sense. Surrender. Unconditional surrender. Michiko stood in the hospital courtyard, her hands still bloody from trying to close a chest wound with fishing line, and tried to understand what she was hearing. Japan didn't surrender. Japan was invincible. The soldiers had promised. The officers had sworn. We will fight until every last person falls. We will never submit to the demons from across the sea. But the Emperor's voice said otherwise. And then the voice stopped, and there was only static, and Michiko realized she was completely alone. She wasn't alone, actually. Across the Pacific, scattered like broken glass across islands and occupied territories, thousands of Japanese women were having the same realization at the same moment. In Saipan, in Okinawa, in occupied China. Women who had served the Imperial Army as nurses, clerks, teachers, translators, comfort station workers. Women who had been sent thousands of miles from home with promises of protection, of purpose, of serving the divine mission of the Emperor. Now the Emperor was gone. The soldiers were dead or surrendered, and the Americans were coming. Akiko heard the news while locked in a room in a comfort station outside Naha. She was 21 years old, and she had been in that room for 3 years. When the Japanese officers fled, they didn't unlock the doors. She and 6 other women broke through a window and ran into streets filled with smoke and rubble. American soldiers were already there, moving through the ruins with weapons raised. Akiko and the others pressed themselves against a wall, trying to become invisible. This was it. The monsters the officers had warned them about. The demons who would do unspeakable things. But the American soldier who found them just looked tired. He was young, maybe 19, with sunburned skin and eyes that wouldn't meet theirs. He shouted something over his shoulder, and more soldiers came. They pointed at a truck. "Get in!" The women climbed into the truck bed, holding each other, waiting for the torture to begin. Instead, someone handed them canteens of water. Someone else gave them ration bars. The truck started moving, and Akiko sat there, her hands shaking, trying to understand why she was still alive. Setsuko was in Manila when the surrender came. She had been a teacher before the war, before she was reassigned to clerical work at a supply depot. She was 25 and pragmatic, the kind of woman who planned for every contingency. When the Americans arrived at the depot, she had already hidden a knife in her clothing. She had already decided she would not be taken alive. She had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. American soldiers were animals. They would use you and discard you. They would laugh while they hurt you. Death was better. But when the Americans came through the door, they were carrying clipboards. They lined the women up, checked names against lists, asked questions through a translator. "Where are you from? How old are you? Are you injured?" The questions were boring, bureaucratic. One soldier gave Setsuko a cigarette. She took it with trembling hands, expecting it to be a trick, some kind of cruel joke. It wasn't. It was just a cigarette. He lit it for her and walked away. The women were loaded onto trucks, given food, transported to ships. The propaganda had prepared them for rape and murder, but not for this strange, cold efficiency. Not for being processed like cargo, uncomfortable but unharmed. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Setsuko sat in the ship's hold during the 3-week voyage to America, trying to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been taught. Maybe they're saving us for something worse. Maybe when we reach America, the real horror begins. Maybe this is just the calm before the storm. The ship was massive, larger than anything most of them had seen. The hull rose like a steel cliff above dark water. Inside, the corridors were narrow and smelled like oil and metal. The women were directed to a holding area deep below deck, a large room with thin mattresses spread across the floor. They were given blankets, 2 meals a day, rice and vegetables, and sometimes bread. More food than many had seen in months. At first, some refused to eat, certain it was poisoned. But hunger won. They ate slowly, waiting for symptoms that never came. Michiko spent those 3 weeks studying the Americans. She watched how they moved, how they talked to each other. She watched the young sailors who brought their meals, noting how some looked at the women with curiosity, others with contempt. A few with something that might have been pity. None of them hurt anyone. None of them even tried. The soldiers stayed on their side of the ship. The women stayed on theirs. It was all very orderly, very regulated. It made no sense. She tried to explain this to the other women one night, whispering in the darkness of the hold, "They're not treating us like enemies. They're treating us like problems, like cargo that needs to be moved from point A to point B." One woman shook her head violently. "You're naive. Wait until we reach land. Wait until there are no witnesses. Then you'll see their true nature." But Michiko wasn't sure anymore. She had been a nurse long enough to recognize patterns of behavior. If these men wanted to hurt them, they would have done it already. There had been plenty of opportunities. Instead, there had only been clipboards and ration bars and an almost indifferent professionalism. Akiko said nothing during these conversations. She sat in the corner of the hold, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the wall. The other women knew her story, or enough of it. Comfort woman. The words were never spoken aloud, but everyone knew. It created a strange bubble of space around her, an invisible barrier. Even here, even in captivity, the shame followed her. Sometimes Michiko would sit nearby, not speaking, just present. It was the only kindness she knew how to offer. When they finally saw land, it appeared through the morning fog, like something from a dream. The California coast. Buildings rose in neat rows, untouched by war. Streets were intact. Cars moved along roads. Everything was whole, functioning, alive. The women crowded at the portholes and railings, staring. One woman began to cry, "It's as if the war never touched them." The contrast was too vast to process. They had come from cities that were rubble, from islands where every building was pockmarked with bullet holes. And here was the enemy, living in abundance, in peace, in a world that made their own suffering look small and pointless. The ship docked in San Francisco. The women were processed through immigration in a large warehouse at the port. American officials sat at long tables, stamping papers, asking questions through translators. Name, age, place of birth, occupation before the war. The questions were mechanical, impersonal. The women answered in whispers, still waiting for the trap to spring. From San Francisco, they were loaded onto trains. Clean trains with cushioned seats and windows that opened. The women sat stiffly, afraid to touch anything, convinced this comfort was somehow dangerous. The train traveled east for days. Through the windows, they watched America roll past. Mountains gave way to deserts, then plains, then forests. They saw towns and cities, farms and factories, all untouched by bombs. Children played in yards. Families walked down sidewalks. Everything looked normal, mundane, impossible. Setsuko pressed her face against the glass, trying to understand how any country could be this big, this whole. In Japan, she had watched children eating grass to survive. She had seen families huddle in bomb shelters, burning furniture for warmth. And here was the enemy, living as though war was something that happened to other people. How did we ever think we could win? The question came from an older woman, barely a whisper. No one answered. The question was too dangerous, too close to treason. But everyone was thinking it. If America looked like this, if they had this much, this many resources, this much land untouched by war, how had Japan ever believed victory was possible? What else had they been lied to about? The train finally stopped at a small station in Alabama. The heat hit them like a physical force when they stepped onto the platform. September in Alabama was different from Pacific heat, drier, heavier somehow. Buses waited to take them the final distance to Fort McClellan. The women climbed aboard in silence, their bodies tense with anticipation. This was it. This was where the facade would drop, where the real captivity would begin. Fort McClellan appeared through the bus windows as they approached. Guard towers stood at intervals along the fence. Barracks stretched in orderly rows. American soldiers moved about their duties. It looked like a military installation anywhere in the world, functional and austere. But there were no cages, no crowds of jeering civilians, no public displays of humiliation, just buildings and fences and soldiers doing their jobs. The buses stopped at an administrative building. The women were lined up outside, told to wait. An American officer emerged, flanked by a translator. He spoke in English, and the translator converted his words into Japanese. You will be processed. You will be given quarters, uniforms, and assignments. You will work while you are here. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Do you understand? The women nodded, understanding the words, but not what they meant. Work they could understand. Treatment was still a mystery. The first stop was the medical building. The women were lined up outside a long, low structure painted white. The door was propped open, and they could see nurses moving inside in crisp white uniforms. The sight made Michiko's heart clench. She had been a nurse once, in another life. One by one, they were called inside. The examination room was clean, almost sterile. Medical equipment lined the walls, instruments that gleamed under bright lights. An American doctor waited, along with 2 nurses and the translator. When Michiko's turn came, she walked into the room with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the floor. The doctor was an older man with gray hair and glasses. He gestured for her to sit on the examination table. "I need to check your vital signs," the translator explained. "The doctor needs to make sure you are healthy." Michiko sat rigidly as the doctor approached. She flinched when he reached out, but his touch was gentle, professional. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, looked at her eyes and throat. Throughout the examination, he maintained a calm, detached demeanor. He was neither cruel nor especially kind. He was simply a doctor doing his job. When he finished, he made notes on a clipboard and said something to the nurse. The translator turned to Michiko. "You are malnourished and dehydrated. You will be given supplements and a special diet to help you gain weight. Do you have any pain or injuries?" Michiko shook her head, unable to speak. The doctor nodded and gestured that she could go. As she left the room, she felt dizzy with confusion. He had touched her, examined her, and then let her go. No violence, no humiliation, just a medical examination. Outside, the other women waited anxiously for her report. "What did they do?" someone whispered. "They checked me," Michiko said slowly. "Like a doctor. Just like a doctor." The women looked at each other, uncertain how to process this information. After the medical examinations, they were directed to another building. Inside, they found rows of shower stalls and benches. The air was warm and humid, filled with the smell of soap. An American nurse tried to explain through gestures what would happen. They would shower. They would be given soap and shampoo. Their old clothes would be taken and destroyed. They would be given new clothes. The women stood frozen. This was the moment they had been dreading. They would be forced to strip naked before their enemies, to stand vulnerable and exposed. This was where the humiliation would begin. But the nurse simply pointed to the showers and left, closing the door behind her. They were alone. Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to undress. They helped each other with buttons and ties, their movements mechanical, prepared for the worst. When they were naked, they stood huddled together, waiting. Nothing happened. Finally, Michiko stepped forward and turned on one of the showers. Water poured out, and after a moment, it ran hot. Steam began to rise, hot water. Running hot water. Michiko stepped under the stream and gasped. For the first time in over a year, she felt hot water on her skin. She picked up the bar of soap from the shelf. It was white, unmarked, and it smelled clean. She turned it over in her hands, hardly believing it was real. One by one, the other women joined her. They stood under the showers, feeling months of dirt and grime wash away. Some began to cry, the water mixing with their tears. Others laughed, strange, high-pitched sounds that echoed off the tile walls. Akiko scrubbed her skin until it was red, trying to wash away more than just dirt. She worked the soap through her hair. watching the water at her feet turn gray, then gradually clearer. When she finally shut off the water and stood dripping on the tile floor, she felt lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been washed away along with the filth. Clean towels were stacked on shelves. The women dried themselves in silence, still waiting for the cruelty to begin. But there was only the sound of water dripping, the smell of soap, and the strange feeling of being clean. After showering, they were given simple cotton dresses to wear and directed to the mess hall. The building was large with long tables and benches. The smell of cooking food hit them as soon as they entered, and several women stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed. American soldiers were eating at some of the tables. They glanced at the Japanese women with curiosity, but made no aggressive moves. The women were directed to a separate section of the hall where trays had been set out. On each tray was more food than most of them had seen in months. White rice, steamed vegetables, a piece of chicken, a roll with butter, and a cup of something that looked like pudding. There was also a tall glass of milk. The women stood staring at the trays, unable to move. This had to be a trick, a test of some kind. Or perhaps it was meant for someone else. Sit. Eat. An American soldier gestured to the tables. His tone was not unkind, just matter of fact. Slowly, the women sat down. They picked up their forks with trembling hands. Michiko looked at her tray, then at Akiko, who sat across from her. Akiko nodded slightly, and they both took small bites. The rice was perfect, soft and white. The vegetables were cooked, but still had texture. The chicken was tender, seasoned with herbs they couldn't identify. It was real food, prepared with care, served hot. Some of the women began to cry as they ate. Others ate mechanically, their faces blank. A few couldn't eat at all, their throats closing with emotion. Michiko ate slowly, methodically, her medical training kicking in. Her body needed this food. She would eat, even if her mind couldn't process what it meant. But as she swallowed each bite, questions swirled in her head. Why were they being fed like this? What did the Americans want? In Japan, she had treated wounded soldiers who were given nothing but rice gruel when there was anything at all. Civilians had starved in the streets. Children had died of malnutrition. And here, the enemy was feeding their prisoners chicken and pudding. The contradiction was too large to hold in her mind. She looked around the mess hall, studying the American soldiers. They looked tired, bored, ready to go home. They weren't monsters. They were just men who wanted to finish their duty and leave. After the meal, they were taken to their barracks. The building was simple but clean, with rows of beds lined up along the walls. Each bed had a mattress, sheets, a pillow, and a thin blanket. At the foot of each bed was a small footlocker. An American officer speaking through the translator explained the rules. They would rise at 6 in the morning. They would have breakfast at 7. They would be assigned work duties. They would have lunch at noon and dinner at 6. Lights out at 10. They were not to leave their designated areas without permission. They were to obey all orders from American personnel. The women listened in silence, trying to absorb this information. It sounded like military routine, structured and orderly. It did not sound like punishment. When the officer left, the women explored their new quarters cautiously. Setsuko sat on her assigned bed and tested the mattress. It was thin but clean, softer than anything she had slept on in over a year. She touched the sheets, white cotton, slightly rough, but whole. No tears, no patches. That night, lying in the darkness, the women whispered to each other, "Maybe they're saving us for labor camps. Maybe this is temporary, until they decide what to do with us. Maybe they're being kind now, so we'll cooperate later. No one could accept that this might simply be how it was. There had to be a catch. There had to be something worse coming. But days passed, and nothing worse came. They were assigned work duties. Some women went to the laundry facility to wash military uniforms and linens. Others worked in the kitchens, preparing food for the base. A few, like Setsuko, were assigned to clerical work, filing papers, and organizing supply records. The work was tedious, but not difficult. No one beat them. No one screamed at them. The American supervisors showed them what to do, and then left them alone to do it. Michiko was assigned to work in the base hospital. When she told the translator she had nursing experience, they put her in the medical ward under supervision. The first day, she stood in the doorway of the ward, looking at the clean white beds, the modern equipment, the shelves stocked with medications. An American nurse named Helen showed her around, speaking slowly in English and using gestures. Bandages here, medications there, patient charts on this clipboard. Michiko followed along, her hands remembering motions she thought she'd forgotten. Helen treated her like a colleague, not a prisoner. She demonstrated how to change IV bags, how to record vital signs on the American charts, how to prepare medication trays. When Michiko made a mistake, Helen corrected her gently, showing her the right way, without anger. By the end of the first week, Michiko was working alongside the American nurses, checking on patients, distributing medications, changing dressings. The work gave her something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. In the laundry, Akiko worked the large industrial washing machines, loading uniforms and sheets, adding soap, starting the cycles. The work was hot and repetitive, but there was something meditative about it. The noise of the machines blocked out thought. Her hands stayed busy. She didn't have to talk to anyone. The other women in the laundry left her alone, sensing her need for isolation. But one of the American supervisors, an older woman named Betty, made a point of checking on her each day. "You okay?" Betty would ask, her wrinkled face concerned. Akiko would nod, not understanding the words but recognizing the tone. Kindness. It made her want to cry every time. Setsuko kept her diary hidden in her footlocker, writing in it late at night when the others slept. She documented everything: the food they received, the work assignments, the way the guards spoke to them, the small interactions that didn't make sense. September 23rd, she wrote, "Today, an American soldier gave me an extra roll at lunch. I didn't ask for it. He just put it on my tray and smiled. I still don't understand what they want from us." 3 weeks passed. The routine became familiar. Wake, work, eat, sleep. No one hurt them. No one starved them. No one violated them. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Some women clung harder to the propaganda, insisting this was all an elaborate deception. Others began to quietly question. If the Americans are monsters, why do they act like this? If we are their hated enemies, why do they feed us better than our own army fed us? The conversations happened in whispers, in corners, in the few minutes before lights out. Dangerous conversations. Treasonous thoughts. One woman said, "I heard that in Japanese POW camps, American prisoners were starved and beaten. But here we are, in their camp, and they give us 3 meals a day and medical care. What does that mean?" No one wanted to answer. The answer was too terrible. It meant everything they had believed was backwards. Michiko found herself watching Dr. Harrison, the base physician who oversaw the medical ward. He was in his 50s, gray-haired, with tired eyes and gentle hands. He treated every patient the same way, whether American soldier or Japanese prisoner. She watched him spend 30 minutes setting a broken bone for a woman who had injured herself in the laundry. She watched him stay late to monitor a patient with pneumonia. She watched him explain medical procedures through the translator with patients, making sure the women understood what was happening to their bodies. One afternoon, she found the courage to ask him a question through the translator. "Why do you help us? We are your enemies." Dr. Harrison looked at her for a long moment, his tired eyes thoughtful. "I'm a doctor," he said simply. "That's all that matters in here. Out there, maybe we were enemies. In here, you're patients. That's all." The simplicity of his answer was more devastating than any cruelty could have been. He wasn't trying to be kind, he wasn't making a moral statement. He was just doing his job according to his principles. The realization hit Michiko like a physical blow. What if morality wasn't about nationality? What if basic human decency didn't depend on which side you were on? The thought was revolutionary and terrifying. She shared this conversation with the others that night. Some rejected it immediately. "He's lying. It's propaganda." But others listened with hungry expressions, desperate for something to believe in. That made sense. Setsuko wrote in her diary, "If an American doctor treats enemies with more dignity than our own officers treated us, what does that say about us? About them? About everything we were taught?" October came. The Alabama heat began to ease slightly. The women had been at Fort McClellan for 6 weeks. Their bodies had recovered somewhat. Regular meals had put weight back on their frames. Their skin no longer looked gray. The constant terror had faded into something else, a strange suspended state between fear and confusion. They existed in a routine that was uncomfortable, but not unbearable, puzzling, but not horrifying. And then Tamiko got sick. She was a quiet woman, mid-30s, who kept to herself and rarely spoke. She had been a schoolteacher in Osaka before the war. No one knew much about her. She did her work in the kitchens without complaint, ate her meals in silence, slept without crying out. But one morning during roll call, she collapsed. The fever came on fast. By afternoon, she was burning up, her body shaking with chills, her breath coming in labored gasps. The guards carried her to the medical ward, and word spread through the camp immediately. The other women gathered, following at a distance, their old fears resurging. This was it. Now they would see. A sick Japanese woman, vulnerable, at the mercy of American doctors. This was where the mask would drop. They crowded into the doorway of the medical ward, 47 women pressing together, watching. Tamiko lay on the floor where the guards had set her down, too weak to stand. Her skin was gray, her lips cracked and bleeding. Pneumonia, Michiko thought automatically, recognizing the symptoms. Advanced pneumonia. Without antibiotics, she would die. Dr. Harrison came through the door from his office, still shrugging on his white coat. He saw Tamiko on the floor, and his expression didn't change. No disgust, no anger, no cruel satisfaction at seeing an enemy suffer. He simply moved. He knelt beside her on that cold floor, his knees touching the dirty tile. He slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees, and he lifted her. The room went completely silent. 47 women held their breath. Dr. Harrison carried Tamiko to the examination table as carefully as if she were made of porcelain. He laid her down gently, arranged a pillow under her head, pulled a blanket over her shaking body. Then he began to work. He checked her pulse, his fingers steady on her wrist. He listened to her lungs with a stethoscope, his face grave. He called out orders to the nurses, his voice calm but urgent. "Start an IV. Oxygen. Get me the penicillin." He rolled up his sleeves and inserted the IV needle himself, finding the vein on the first try. He adjusted the oxygen mask over her face, making sure it fit properly. He administered the antibiotic injection, his hands gentle despite her fevered thrashing. For 30 minutes, he worked. The nurses assisted him with quiet efficiency. No one spoke except to relay information. Pulse 120. Respiration shallow. Temperature 104. Dr. Harrison moved from task to task with focused intensity, fighting for this woman's life as though she were his own daughter, as though she mattered, as though her life had value. Michiko stood in the doorway, her medical training allowing her to follow everything he was doing. And she understood. He was using expensive medications. He was devoting his personal time. He was applying the full force of his skill and knowledge to save the life of an enemy prisoner who would never be able to thank him or repay him. He was doing it because that was what doctors did. That was the job. Nationality didn't matter. The uniform didn't matter. There was a human being dying in front of him, and he was trying to stop it. Around her, the other women were crying, some silently, tears streaming down their faces, others sobbing openly, their hands over their mouths. Akiko had sunk to her knees, her whole body shaking. Setsuko was repeating the same phrase over and over. "I don't understand. I don't understand." One of the American nurses, a young woman with kind eyes, held Tomiko's hand as Dr. Harrison worked. She stroked the sick woman's hair, murmuring soft words in English that Tomiko couldn't understand, but seemed to respond to anyway. The tenderness of the gesture broke something fundamental in the watching women. This wasn't supposed to happen. Enemies didn't do this. Demons didn't do this. Everything they had been taught, everything they had believed, was collapsing in real time. After 30 minutes, Tomiko's breathing began to stabilize. The oxygen and antibiotics were working. Her color improved slightly. The violent shaking eased. Dr. Harrison checked her vital signs again and nodded, satisfied. He said something to the nurses, and they began preparing to move her to a recovery bed. He stood there for a moment longer, looking down at his patient, and then he turned to leave. That's when he saw the 47 women in the doorway. He stopped, surprised. He hadn't realized they were there, watching. For a moment, no one moved. The women stared at him, their faces wet with tears, their eyes full of something too complex to name. Dr. Harrison looked back at them, confused by their reaction. He glanced down at Tomiko, then back at the women, and then, slowly, understanding seemed to dawn on his face. "She'll be okay," he said through the translator who had materialized beside him. "She needs rest and medication, but she'll recover." The translator conveyed the words, but the women barely heard them. They were still processing what they had just witnessed, still trying to reconcile it with everything they had been taught. Michiko found her voice first. "Why?" she asked in broken English. "Why save her? We are enemies." Dr. Harrison looked at her, his tired eyes sad. "Because I'm a doctor," he said slowly, making sure she could understand. "That's all that matters in here." The next morning, Tomiko was moved to a recovery room. The women were allowed to visit her in shifts, 2 at a time. She was weak but conscious, her fever broken by the antibiotics. The IV drip continued steadily into her arm. An American nurse checked on her every hour, adjusting blankets, offering water, monitoring her progress. Tomiko looked at each visitor with confused gratitude, as though she couldn't quite believe she was still alive. Dr. Harrison came to check on her 3 times that first day. Each time, he performed the same gentle examination, checking her breathing, her temperature, her hydration. He spoke to her in his broken Japanese, simple phrases he had learned. Better today. Good. You rest. His presence was calm, unhurried, professional. He treated her recovery as though it were the most important thing in his world at that moment. The incident changed something fundamental in the camp. The walls the women had built around themselves, the protective barriers of suspicion and fear, began to crack. Not all at once, not for everyone, but slowly, like ice melting under spring sun, the rigid certainty began to thaw. Michiko started asking questions during her shifts in the medical ward. She asked Helen about medications, about procedures, about American medical training. Helen answered patiently, sometimes sketching diagrams to explain complex concepts. They developed a working relationship that gradually became something more. Not quite friendship, the Gulf of War was too recent for that, but mutual respect, professional regard. Two nurses who understood the same calling. Akiko began accepting Betty's daily check-ins in the laundry. She started responding with small nods, then, eventually, with words. Yes, okay. Her English was limited, but Betty seemed to understand more than the words conveyed. One day, Betty brought a photograph from her wallet and showed it to Akiko. A young woman, maybe 19, with Betty's smile. My daughter, Betty said. Sarah. She's your age. Akiko looked at the photograph for a long time, then back at Betty's weathered face. She saw the love there, the pride, the same emotions her own mother had shown before the war scattered everything. She handed the photo back carefully and whispered, Beautiful. Setsuko's diary entries changed tone. November 2nd. I don't know what to believe anymore. They treat us better than our own army treated us. The doctor saved Tomiko's life because that's what doctors do. The nurse shows me pictures of her daughter. The guard gave me an extra blanket when he saw me shivering. These are not the actions of demons. These are the actions of people. What does that make us? What does that make everything we did? The women began to talk more openly with each other, no longer whispering in corners. The conversations were painful, full of cognitive dissonance and grief. I watched soldiers push women and children off cliffs in Saipan. One woman said, The officers told us the Americans would do worse. But the Americans haven't done anything. What if those people died for a lie? I worked in a comfort station, Akiko said one night, her voice steady for the first time. Japanese officers. They treated us like objects, like broken tools to be used and discarded. I was taken from my village in Korea at 17. I'm 21 now, 4 years. And in those 4 years, no one treated me like I mattered. But here, in enemy captivity, the doctor lifts a sick woman from the floor with his own hands. The nurse holds her hand. They care. She looked around at the other women. I spent 4 years serving the Emperor's men. They showed me cruelty. The enemy showed me dignity. What am I supposed to do with that? The silence that followed was heavy with shared pain. These were truths too dangerous to speak aloud in their old world. But their old world was gone, reduced to ash by atomic fire. Here, in this strange suspended place, they could finally say the unspeakable. Michiko spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. I was a nurse in field hospitals. I saw how our army treated wounded soldiers. They were given minimal care, sometimes no anesthesia, for surgery. I amputated limbs with soldiers screaming because we had no morphine. And I was told this was discipline, this was strength, this was the Japanese way. But here, they give antibiotics to a prisoner. They use their expensive medications on people who were trying to kill them weeks ago. That's not weakness. That's not foolishness. That's something else. Something better. It means we were wrong, Setsuko said quietly. About everything. The words hung in the air, terrible and liberating. They were wrong. About the Americans. About the war. About the righteousness of their cause. About the divine mission of the Emperor. Wrong about everything. The grief of that realization was crushing. They had sacrificed years, endured horrors, lost everything for a lie. But underneath the grief was something else, something that felt dangerously like relief. Christmas came. The Americans decorated the mess hall with colored paper and lights. Someone brought in a tree and covered it with handmade ornaments. The women watched these preparations with confusion. They didn't understand the holiday, but they understood celebration. On Christmas Day, they were included. Extra food was served, sweet things they had never tasted, cookies and cake and candied fruits. Small gifts appeared at their bunks, wrapped in newspaper. Soap, scarves, chocolates, pencils. Nothing expensive, but each item chosen with thought. Akiko received a small doll, soft cloth with button eyes and yarn hair. The tag said it was from Betty's daughter, Sarah. Akiko held that doll and cried until she couldn't breathe. Michiko received a medical book in English from Dr. Harrison. The inscription inside read, "For a fellow healer. May you continue to help others." Setsuko received a blank notebook and a box of pencils. She knew, somehow, that someone understood she was writing things down, recording this impossible time.